This video was created using artificial intelligence, AI, for educational and narrative purposes. All characters and events are fictionalized representations inspired by historical realities. Viewer discretion is advised. You were born into the thick, sulfurous breath of a town that had already died long before you took your first gulp of air. The hospital was a gray, concrete monolith, where the heaters rattled with a dry, metallic cough, and the linoleum floors were stained with the ghosts of 1,000 unwashed tragedies. There was no soft light or hushed reverence for your arrival. You were simply a statistic, a weight recorded on a flickering digital scale. Another mouth that would eventually demand resources the environment was no longer prepared to provide. The windows of the maternity ward looked out onto a landscape of rusted skeletal remains. Abandoned factories and collapsed warehouses that loomed like gravestones over a graveyard of industry. From the very first second, the air you breathed was heavy with the fine, invisible dust of pulverized brick and chemical residue. No one smiled when they held you. They only looked at you with a weary, calculating dread, wondering how long the meager heat in your rented home would last before the winter set in. You were born into a world of hard edges and cold surfaces, where optimism was a luxury that had been traded away decades ago for survival. Your father was not a man so much as he was a collection of jagged memories and muffled groans. He sat in the kitchen in a permanent state of semi-darkness, his silhouette carved out by the flickering light of a television that played nothing but static. He was a veteran of a war that everyone had agreed to forget, and he carried the weight of it in the way his shoulders sloped and the way his hands shook when he reached for a glass. He did not look at you. He looked through you as if you were a ghost haunting his living room. Your mother was a hollowed-out shell, her spirit eroded by the relentless grind of 3 part-time jobs and the crushing reality of a husband who was physically present but mentally buried in a trench halfway across the world. She did not offer you comfort because she had none left to give. She moved through the house with a mechanical, joyless efficiency, her touch as cold as the damp walls. You learned early that a cry for help was merely a noise that irritated the silence. You weren't raised, you were tolerated, a biological obligation in a household where the only thing in abundance was resentment. By the time your hands were large enough to wrap around the handle of a bucket, you were put to work. There was no transition from infancy to childhood, only a shift in your utility. Your value was defined by the physical labor you could perform to keep the household from sliding entirely into the abyss. You spent your mornings hauling heavy plastic jugs of water from the communal tap because the pipes in your building had long ago succumbed to lead and rot. Your afternoons were spent scavenging the perimeter of the scrapyards, looking for bits of copper or aluminum that could be traded for a loaf of bread or a gallon of kerosene. Play was a concept you observed from a distance, watching through the chain-link fences of the wealthier districts where children ran on green grass. For you, the earth was only dirt and broken glass. Your muscles ached with a dull, constant throb that became the baseline of your existence. You learned to suppress the hunger in your stomach by tightening your belt and drinking lukewarm water. You were a servant to the decay of your own home, a tiny cog trying to hold back the collapse of a machine that was already broken. The world outside your door was equally indifferent to your presence. You existed in a bureaucratic void, a shadow without a paper trail. You were never registered for school because the local district had been dissolved, and the nearest one required a proof of residency your parents couldn't provide. You had no birth certificate in your possession, no medical records, and no digital footprint that the law cared to track. To the state, you were an invisible variable. If you had fallen into one of the open manholes in the alley or been swept away by the toxic runoff of the spring rains, no alarm would have sounded. No search party would have been formed. You learned the terrifying freedom of being completely unimportant. You could walk through the streets and see the police cruisers pass by without a glance, their occupants looking for real threats, not for the malnourished children living in the seams of the city. You were a ghost while still breathing, a human being with the social standing of a stray rat. Violence was the only consistent education you received. It wasn't the cinematic violence of heroes and villains, but the casual, repetitive cruelty of the desperate. You watched from a cracked window as a neighbor was beaten until his face was unrecognizable, all for the sake of a pair of boots. You saw how the crowd gathered not to help, but to see if anything of value would be left behind once the attackers fled. You experienced it yourself when the older boys in the block needed to vent their own frustrations, their fists landing on your ribs with a sickening, wet thud that taught you more about the fragility of the human frame than any book ever could. No one ever intervened. No one ever called for justice. The violence was as natural as the weather, a seasonal storm that broke over the weak and the slow. It taught you that your body was a liability, a target that needed to be hardened or hidden. You learned to walk with your eyes on the ground, measuring the distance between cover, internalizing the lesson that peace was merely the absence of a witness. The only warmth you ever knew came from a small, mangy dog that had crawled into your crawl space to die. You found it shivering, its ribs tracing sharp lines beneath a coat of matted gray fur. Instead of driving it away, you brought it the scraps you had stolen from the market, shriveled carrots and bits of gristle. For 2 years, this animal was the only thing in the universe that looked at you with recognition. It would wait for you at the end of the alley, its tail a rhythmic thump against the damp concrete. You whispered your secrets into its ears, telling it about the dreams you were starting to have, of a place where the air didn't smell like burning rubber. Then, one evening, you returned to find the crawl space empty and the alleyway stained with a dark, heavy smear of red. A local gang had used the animal for target practice, a bored afternoon's entertainment. You found the body tossed into a trash heap, discarded with less thought than a crumpled soda can. When you looked at the remains, you didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of you. You simply realized that anything you loved would be used as a weapon against you. You were finally completely untethered. The rescue arrived in the form of a man who smelled of starch and expensive tobacco. He wore a uniform that was so clean it looked like it belonged to a different species. He sat in a makeshift office in the ruins of the town square, surrounded by posters of soaring jets and smiling men in formation. He spoke to you in a voice that was firm, paternal, and utterly devoid of the jagged edges of your hometown. He promised you a way out. He promised you 3 meals a day, a bed with clean sheets, and the chance to be part of something larger than your own survival. He called it service. He called it honor. He looked at your calloused hands and your hollowed eyes, and told you that you were exactly the kind of man the country needed. You signed the enlistment papers because you were starving, and because the idea of a structured death seemed infinitely better than the chaotic one waiting for you in the alley. You thought you were being saved. You didn't understand that you were simply being processed into a different kind of scrap. The transition was violent and absolute. The moment you stepped off the bus at the training depot, the person you had been was executed. They took your name and gave you a number. They shaved your head until your scalp felt cold and exposed, stripping away the last vestige of your individual appearance. You were fitted into a uniform that was stiff and smelled of chemicals, a garment designed to make you indistinguishable from the 1,000 other bodies surrounding you. Your autonomy was replaced by a series of barked commands and Pavlovian responses. You were taught to eat when told, sleep when told, and move with a mechanical precision that left no room for thought. They broke your spirit with sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion, then rebuilt it around a core of ironclad obedience. You stopped thinking about the dog, the gray town, and the parents who hadn't noticed you were gone. You became a biological extension of the state, a tool that had been sharpened and polished for a singular lethal purpose. You quickly understood the architecture of the machine you now inhabited. It was a hierarchy built on the systematic distribution of cruelty. At the top were the commanders, men who existed as names on memos and voices over speakers, who viewed the world through satellite imagery and casualty projections. Below them were the officers who managed the logistics of your life with a cold academic detachment. Then came the sergeants, the men who had been forged in the same fires you were now entering, who had lost their humanity long ago and replaced it with a devotion to the regulation. And then there was you. You were the foundation, the disposable mass upon which the entire structure rested. You were told that you were a brotherhood, but you knew that if you tripped in the mud, the boots of the men behind you would crush your fingers without hesitation. Power flowed downward, and the only thing that flowed upward was the silence of the obedient. You were a resource to be spent, a battery to be drained until you were empty. Your body was no longer a vessel for your soul. It was a government-issued piece of equipment. You were subjected to a constant barrage of interventions designed to maximize your output. They pumped you full of experimental vaccines that turned your sweat into the smell of ammonia and kept you awake for 72 hours at a time during readiness exercises. You were forced to carry packs that weighed half as much as you did until the cartilage in your knees began to grind and click. Your hearing was sacrificed to the roar of engines and the crack of explosives. A constant ringing in your ears that became the only soundtrack to your life. When you were sick, you were given pills that numbed the pain but didn't fix the cause. When you were exhausted, you were given stimulants that made your heart hammer against your ribs like a trapped bird. You were an engine being run at redline, and the mechanics didn't care about the long-term wear as long as you crossed the finish line. Consent was a civilian word that had no meaning in the barracks. Amidst the grinding gears, you found Miller. He was a boy from a Corn Belt state that had been hollowed out by the same rot that took your town. He shared his hidden stash of chocolate with you during a night watch in a frozen foxhole. He was the only one who didn't call you by your serial number when the sergeants weren't looking. For a few months, in the middle of a deployment to a desert that felt like the surface of the moon, you allowed yourself to feel the warmth of a human bond. You spoke in low whispers about what you would do when the contract was over. Miller wanted to open a garage. You just wanted to find a place where you didn't have to carry a weapon to go to the bathroom. He was the last fragile piece of the person you used to be. A mirror that showed you a face you still recognized. You promised each other that you would both make it back. A lie that felt like a prayer in the middle of the whistling wind and the distant thud of mortars. The destruction of that bond was clinical and efficient. It happened during a routine convoy, the kind of mission that felt like a chore until the world turned inside out. A pressure plate under the road detonated, and Miller's vehicle vanished in a column of black smoke and twisted metal. There was no heroic final stand. There were no last words. By the time you reached the wreckage, there was nothing left but the smell of ozone and burnt hair. The system didn't stop to let you mourn. The officers took your statement, noted the equipment loss, and ordered the convoy to proceed. Within 24 hours, Miller's bunk was occupied by a new recruit with fresh boots and a blank stare. You were told that grief is a luxury of the home front. You realized then that the system didn't just want your labor. It wanted your attachments dead, because a man with nothing to lose is the most effective weapon. The last thread of your humanity was severed, and you became the machine they wanted you to be. When your service finally ended, they handed you a piece of paper and a bus ticket and told you that you were free. But you weren't free. You were just unmoored. You returned to a world that you no longer understood, and that didn't want to understand you. The Hero's Welcome was a 30-second segment on the local news and a discount at a hardware store you couldn't afford to shop in. You found yourself in a small, damp apartment in a city that felt like a cage. To deal with the roar of the silence, you adopted a coping mechanism of total anesthesia. You started with the opioids the VA gave you for your back, then moved to the cheap, stinging gin that made the walls stop closing in at night. You adopted a cold, rigid sense of duty to your own numbness. You woke up at 0500 every day, cleaned your room with military precision, and then sat in a chair until the sun went down, staring at the wall. Faith was a lie. Honor was a brand name. And the only thing that felt real was the chemical haze that kept the memories of Miller and the dog at a safe distance. Your death was as quiet and unobserved as a falling leaf in a dead forest. You were 53 years old, though your body had the wear of a century. You were sitting at a small plastic table in your kitchen, eating a meal of cold beans from a can, when your heart, scarred by years of stress and stimulants, simply gave up. There was no struggle. You just leaned forward, your forehead resting on the table, and stopped. The world outside continued its frantic, noisy pace. The neighbors didn't notice the lack of movement in your apartment for nearly 2 weeks. The only indicator that you were gone was the pile of unopened mail outside your door and the slow, heavy accumulation of dust on your windows. When the police finally broke the door down, they found a man who had been dead long before his heart stopped beating. They took your body to a state facility, processed the paperwork for an unclaimed veteran, and buried you in a plot with a number instead of a name. There was no justice, no closure, and no disruption to the world you had served. Zoom out now, past the decades and the centuries. The history books written about your era will focus on the grand maneuvers of the generals and the economic shifts of the empires. They will speak of the war you fought in as a series of tactical decisions and geopolitical necessities. Your name will not appear in the index. The records will praise the institutions that trained you, noting the unprecedented efficiency of the mobilization. The thousands of men like you, the invisible, the discarded, the erased, will be collapsed into a single sterile statistic labeled manpower. Your suffering, your loss of Miller, your descent into the bottle, and your lonely death in a rented room will leave no more trace on the historical record than a shadow leaves on a stone. The system that took your birth and turned it into decay, that took your childhood and turned it into labor, and that took your life and turned it into a resource, remains perfectly intact. It is currently recruiting your replacement. The machine does not stop, it does not mourn, and it never forgets to feed.